As we're going to see next week, history is never simple. It's never that one thing after another. That quote from the History Boys. History is very complicated, not just in discovering the cause and effect of things, but in the position different historians take. We're going to see that the interpretations of the history of psychiatry are manifold. There are very, very many different views about why things happened the way that they happened. But just to give you a bit of a flavour, I thought I'd put to you one of the #1 smackdowns in the historiography of psychiatry. The battle, if we can dignify it with the name battle, between Andrew Scull and Edward Shorter. And when I talk about the battle between these two individuals, what I'm really talking about is the face-off between two different books. Scull's Most Solitary of Affliction and Shorter's very well received History of Psychiatry. So let's have a look at the protagonists. Here's Andrew Scull, who's the distinguished professor at the Department of Sociology in the University of California, San Diego. Scull has an agenda, and it's an agenda that derives from his background in sociology and his fascination about social control. For him, through the ages, madness is a problem that requires social control. It requires society to contain it. On top of this, as capitalism develops from the 16th, 17th century onwards and becomes industrialized society, it is essential that new strategies are developed to control deviant population, prisons for criminals, workhouses for the indigent. The insane, the mad people, the asylum, which as Scull says, largely receptacles for the confinement of the impossible, the inconvenient and the inept. On top of which, more recently, he's been at pains to illustrate something that we've already talked about, psychiatry's troubled relations with science. And here I refer to the book Madhouse, his exploration of the Henry Cotton scandal that some of you will have come across if you did Body, Mind and Medicine. Others won't have done, but we'll be talking about it some more later in the subject. And in general, he's deeply critical of psychiatry as an institution. That's not to say that he is exactly anti-psychiatry in the sense that he doesn't believe that mental illness exists. It's that he's deeply suspicious of the motives of psychiatry in trying to control this particular deviant population. He's well aware that mental illness is out there creating a lot of misery, not just for the sufferers, but for the people around the sufferers. So the key ideas that inform him, as I've said, sociology, social control theories that derive from sociology, that look at the way that capitalism develops control over its populations, markets develop control over its populations, but also the way that professionalisation develops and is monitored and represents the interests of the particular group professionalising, represents their desire for upward social mobility, for a high degree of status. In this sense, psychiatry, or indeed any other profession, is driven by self-interest, not by some kind of humane desire to better individuals suffering in society. So here we have it. Psychiatry develops as a response to social, political and economic forces and becomes a tool for the manufacture and control of deviance. Again, I'll reiterate that he's not actually concerned about the reality or not of mental illness. At times he does seem sceptical about it, but he acknowledges the suffering. Let's look at the opposite. If we're facing off these two books, it was Edward Shorter that really started the fight. You know, Scull had put his book out there, and Shorter's response to the ideas that were being put forward in Scull's book basically poo-pooed those kind of social control theories. He was deeply disturbed by Scull's fingering a psychiatrist for being people seeking higher status, not so interested in humanity. What Shorter does is he produces what we would call a Whig history. Whig history is history that focuses on the notion of progress. Progress is all that matters, how we got to our current state of perfection. And this perspective underlines Shorter's book. Now, Shorter himself is a bit mysterious, although we can find a little bit more of him tracking around YouTube at the moment. Certainly there's more of him this year than there was last year. He's the Hanna Professor of the History of Medicine in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto, but he's actually also cross-appointed as Professor of Psychiatry. Now, I don't know whether that means he's actually qualified in psychiatry. I mean, Edward Shorter has an incredibly long track record as a social historian, particularly a social historian of the family. At the moment, his website in psychiatry at the University of Toronto maintains that his therapeutic mission is to look at the clinical psychiatry through a golden oldies approach. What he's looking to do is try and revive old cures or therapies that might have been effective. And in the process, he's actually taking really quite a large pop at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which is going to be one of the principal agents in this subject. In terms of the wider history of Shorter's writing, this is actually a bit of a turn towards something that I wouldn't expect, but I'll try and say something about that at the end of this module. So, in his History of Psychiatry, published in 1997, he maintains that whenever psychiatry is strayed from the path of biology, it has gone seriously wrong. Bad things happen. Psychiatry is principally shaped by its relationship with science, not with market forces, not with capitalism, not with the desire for status from the psychiatrists themselves. And when social forces do impinge on psychiatry, then it's usually to the detriment of the project as a whole. And he rejects specifically using that wonderfully out-of-fashion word, trendy. I don't think people talk about trendy these days. He rejects the trendy explanations of Scull, Foucault, and the others. People he calls zealot researchers, researchers with a political agenda to undermine the humanity and the biologically sound science of psychiatry. But, and this is the sting in the tail, he's become increasingly concerned about the relationship between pharmaceuticals and between psychiatry and the DSM. And in fact, the things that I've been finding that he's been coming out with in the last couple of years begin to sound a little bit like Andrew Scull. I mean, he has, for example, come out and explicitly said that he's not even sure that schizophrenia or bipolar exist, that these are a mistaken category that have been driven by the interests of the pharmaceutical industry and supported by them in developing therapies that match the criteria of the DSM for those particular conditions. Now, I guess that's a bit different to Scull, who is also worried about the pharmaceutical industry, is also concerned about it. But Shorter's actually been more explicit that the problem is pharmaceuticals, not capitalism, not the self-interest of psychiatrists. But it's a very important perspective, this face-off between the Weberian or even Marxist approach on the one hand, and then Shorter's idea that science has this steady progression, and as long as science just does science and doesn't get infected by outside forces, it goes along very, very nicely indeed. Now, as we'll see, there are many other explanations of the way that psychiatry is developed, and they all to some degree overlap with these different views. And it's also noticeable that if you face off the most solitary of afflictions against the history of psychiatry, they almost reproduce the divide that we find within psychiatry itself between biological explanations of psychiatric illness and psychosocial explanations of psychiatric illness. So they kind of reproduce the divisions that I've already talked about and will become a major factor in our study. And with that, I draw to a close this particular module, the last module of Lecture 1.